Hello, my name is Ian Murphy. Today we're going to go ahead and continue on with Chapter 8 of Merchants of Sin by Benjamin Garland. Alright, Chapter 8, Jews and Film. Quote, as soon as the Jew gained control of the movies, we had a movie problem, the consequences of which are not yet visible. It is the genius of that race to create problems of a moral character in whatever business they achieve a majority. End quote. Henry Ford. The movie industry, according to film historian Robert Sklar, was completely in the hands of respectable established Anglo-Saxon Protestant Americans before Jewish immigrants began taking it over in 1911. By 1915, the Jew Karl Laemmle had crushed all his competitors using every dirty trick at his disposal and had become head of the largest studio, Universal. Quote, from this point on, end quote, Neil Gabler writes in An Empire of Their Own how the Jews invented Hollywood. Quote, the Jews would control the movies, end quote. There was much concern over the potential harm that movies could do to public morality from the very beginning. In 1915, the same year that the Jews effectively took over Hollywood, the Supreme Court denied First Amendment rights to cinema with Mutual Film Corporation versus Industrial Commission of Ohio. This decision gave local censors the right to screen movies before allowing their showing, making film the only medium ever subject to prior restraint, censorship in the history of America. Quote, the exhibition of moving pictures is a business, pure and simple, end quote, the court declared. Acknowledging that motion pictures could be used for good, such as for education, the judges decided that they, quote, may be used for evil, end quote, as well, especially since their audiences include not just men and women, but also children. The salient aspect of the history of the Jewish domination of the American film industry is the lack of any open acknowledgement of the Jews as an ethnic group among their opposition. This is despite it being a well-known, obvious, and despised fact that the Jews were using the movies for ill. For instance, the 1922 anti-Hollywood pamphlet The Sins of Hollywood, the most popular of its time, describes a movie producer who is preying on a pretty aspiring actress as, quote, small, dark-haired, with a bullet head and a low receding brow, and a large nose and small ratty eyes, end quote. He is also given a suspiciously Yiddish-sounding accent, making it pretty clear that the character is a Jew. Yet he is never explicitly named as such. Calling a Jew was out of bounds of respectability, apparently even way back then. The one prominent American who did have the courage to come forward and openly name and oppose the Jews was the great industrialist Henry Ford. His newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, which he distributed for free to hundreds of thousands of Americans every week, ran a total of 91 anti-Semitic articles. 3 of them were concerning Jews and the movies. Quote, there is little wisdom in discoursing against evil in the movies and deliberately closing our eyes to the forces behind the evil, end quote. One such article reads, quote, the purpose of this and succeeding articles, end quote, it continues, quote, is not to lift hands in horror and point out how rotten the movies are. Everybody is doing that. The case against the movies is not contested at all. It is unanimous. Women's clubs, teachers, newspaper editors, police officers, judges of the courts, ministers or religion, physicians, mothers, and fathers. Everybody knows just what the movies are. What all these disgusted groups evidently do not know is this. Their protests will be entirely useless until they realize that behind the movies, there is another group of definite moral and racial complexion, ... They can go on beating the air for a lifetime and still obtain no improvement unless they face the unpleasant racial fact that the movies are Jewish. It is not a question of morals. That question has been settled. It is a question of management." End quote. In 1921 alone, there were almost 100 bills introduced in 37 states calling for the regulation of motion pictures. So in 1922, the same year, as the distribution of both Ford's articles and The Sins of Hollywood pamphlet quoted above, the major Hollywood studios hired U.S. Postmaster General Will H. Hayes to head the newly formed Motion Picture Association of America, MPAA, for the purpose of regulating film content in order to prevent a government crackdown. The MPAA drew up guidelines in the form of the Formula in 1924, the Don'ts and Be Carefuls in 1927, and finally the Production Code in 1930, which was not fully enforced until they hired Joseph Breen and formed the Production Code Administration in 1934. The period between the writings of the Production Code and its actual enforcement, 1930 to 1934, is what is known as the pre-code Hollywood, during which producers continuously pushed the moral boundaries over time. In response, Catholics formed the Legion of Decency for the stated purpose of boycotting and condemning, quote, absolutely those salacious motion pictures which, with other degrading agencies, are corrupting public morals and promoting a sex mania in our land, end quote. The Catholic Legion of Decency threat of boycott loomed heavily over the Hollywood Jews. This was no empty threat. On one occasion, they organized a protest in Philadelphia, and the profits for that city dropped by 40%. Breen was a prime example of Ford's complaint about the futility of people opposing Jewish behavior, without ever naming them directly. According to multiple private correspondences, he was anti-Semitic, but he never dared to be so publicly. In 1932, he wrote to a Jesuit confidant that the Jews are a, quote, a rotten bunch of vile people with no respect for anything beyond the making of money, ... Here in Hollywood, we have paganism rampant, and its most virulent form, drunkenness and debauchery, are commonplace. Sexual perversion is rampant. Any number of our directors and stars are perverts. These Jews seem to think of nothing but making money and sexual indulgence. 95% of these folks are Jews of an Eastern European lineage. They are probably the scum of the earth. End quote. He wrote to his assistant, Martin Quigley, that same year, quote, the fact is that these damn Jews are a dirty, filthy lot. End quote. 2 years later, again in a letter to a Jesuit, while referring to one movie official as, quote, a kike Jew of the very lowest type, end quote, Breen claimed to be the one man, quote, who could cram decent ethics down the throats of the Jews, end quote. Breen and the Legion of the Decency did in fact effectively rein in the Jews' urge to promote degeneracy and immorality, at least for a time. The first serious, quote, chink in the code's armor, end quote, according to Leonard J. Leff and Gerald L. Simmons, in their history of the production code, the dame in the kimono came from the movie The Bicycle Thief, which had been imported from Italy by the Jew Joseph Burstein in 1948. After viewing the film, Breen declared that he had found 2 scenes objectionable and wanted them removed prior to the issuing of a seal. Both seemed rather innocuous, especially by today's standards. One of the scenes showed a boy, filmed from the back, pausing to urinate on a wall before his father called him away. The other showed characters running through a brothel, though nothing even remotely explicit is shown. The former Breen considered, quote, toilet humor, end quote, which he categorically rejected. The latter he considered dangerous in that, quote, such locales inescapably suggest commercialized vice and human depravity and arouse unwholesome interest and curiosity on the part of the youth, end quote. Burstein skillfully whipped up controversy over this, knowing that the film would rise in popularity accordingly. After it won Academy Award for Best Foreign Film, Breen, under pressure, from multiple civil liberty organizations, the media, and even the Legion of Decency finally backed down and gave it a seal without the recommended cuts. His reasoning for wanting the scenes cut was the following, quote, "If for any reason whatsoever such scenes are to be appraised as acceptable, such approval may be properly deemed to set a precedent for all future motion pictures. ... The motion pictures will be flooded with similar scenes." End quote. A very precedent observation, one could argue, given that Jewish Hollywood films, especially so-called comedies, have now developed into almost nothing but toilet humor and human depravity. Burstein, a Polish-born Jewish immigrant, was initially a diamond polisher, but after making a decent enough turnover from a screening of the movie A Jew at War, he went into the business of exclusively importing foreign films. In 1952, 4 years after The Bicycle Thief, he again caused controversy by importing another Italian film called The Miracle. Catholics aggressively protested The Miracle and blocked its showing in New York theaters because they found it to be sacrilegious. Burstein, spending more than $60,000 of his own money, which is over $500,000 in today's value, brought the movie to the Supreme Court, where it resulted in the landmark decision of Joseph Burstein, Inc. versus Wilson, also known as the Miracle decision. Miracle overturned Mutual and freed movies from the burden of prior restraint. Films were not seen as, quote, a business pure and simple, end quote, anymore, but as a medium worthy of full First Amendment protections. The Miracle was defended by the Jew Ephraim London, who was the uncle of the prominent Jewish feminist Robin Morgan of the Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, see Part 7. London, who once opined on a television show that if people, quote, want to publicly perform intercourse on a nightclub stage or defecate or anything like that, end quote, they should be allowed, ultimately argued 9 film cases before the Supreme Court, The Miracle being the first, and incredibly won them all. The production code's main nemesis was the Jew Otto Preminger, who actively and openly defied it repeatedly. Following the Miracle decision, he submitted the script for The Moon is Blue, and it was rejected by both the Legion of Decency and the Production Code Administration, with Breen accused it of having, quote, an unacceptable cavalier approach towards seduction and illicit sex, end quote. Preminger went ahead with the film anyway. During the press conferences for it, he repeatedly slammed Breen for his, quote, hypocritical interpretation of an antiquated code, end quote, and foreshadowing the weapon the Jews would soon use to topple the code entirely. Compared the very concept of censorship to Nazism. Quote, it is an evil institution, and if we give into it on small matters, this is the first step toward the kind of totalitarian government that destroyed my country, Austria, end quote. After having the film rejected by both Warner Bros. And Paramount for being too risky, Preminger convinced the Jews Arthur Krim and Robert S. Benjamin to produce it unedited with their company United Artists, and then released it without code approval, a frontal assault on Joseph L. Breen. Following its release, The Moon is Blue was censored in many states and outright banned in 3, Maryland, Ohio, and Kansas. Preminger and United Artists took the Kansas ban all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, where, with the help of Ephraim London, they got the ban reversed. The Moon is Blue, due to its success in spite of not being code approved, quote, sounded the death rattle of the Legion of Decency and the Production Code, end quote, wrote Leff and Simmons. Following the Miracle decision and the subsequent 1957 Roth decision, see Part 3, independent filmmakers who were not bound by the Production Code as the major studios in Hollywood were, began pushing the envelope by producing what were called the nudie cutie and sexploitation films. Beginning with Russ Meyer's The Immoral Mr. T's 1959, These were the first above-ground films to feature gratuitous nudity without being in the nudist or naturalist genre. They initially played in what were known as grindhouse theaters, but slowly moved into more mainstream ones. Next to Mayer, the Jew David F. Friedman is by far the biggest name associated with sexploitation. He pioneered several extreme sexploitation subgenres. In 1963, he produced Scum of the Earth using the pseudonym Davis Freeman. Scum of the Earth is considered the first in the rough subgenre of sexploitation. Roughies, in general, were violent revenge films. In the beginning, they would show a woman or multiple women being brutally raped or otherwise abused and tortured by men, and by the end, the men would be shown on the receiving end of the graphic violence. Also in 1963, he produced Blood Feast, which is considered the first in the gore or splatter genre. In 1969, using the pseudonym Herman Traeger, he produced Love Camp 7. This was the first film of maybe the most bizarre sexploitation subgenre of all. Nazi-ploitation. These films were gory, sexually explicit, over-the-top horror fantasies that featured cartoonish Nazis conducting all kinds of deranged experiments on concentration camp inmates. The mother of all Nazi-ploitation films was Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, again produced by Friedman and Traeger. Here is the part of the plot summary for Ilsa, as found on Wikipedia, to give you an idea of just how sick and weird these types of movies were. Quote, Ilsa is commandant of a Nazi prison camp who conducts sadistic scientific experiments designed to demonstrate that women are more capable of enduring pain than men are. ... Ilsa is also portrayed as a buxom woman with a varicose sexual appetite for men. Every night she chooses another of her male prisoners and rapes them. However, owing to her hypersexuality, she is disappointed when her current victim eventually ejaculates and promptly has him castrated and put to death. Only one American prisoner who can avoid ejaculating manages to use her weakness to his favor. In 1964, the Supreme Court again weighed in on the issue on film censorship with the highly significant landmark case Jacobellis versus Ohio. It was this case which was over the showing of the French film Les Amants, The Lovers, where Justice Potter Stewart, when trying to define pornography, made the famous oft-repeated and mocked statement, quote, I know it when I see it, end quote. The Jacobellis case, which was again argued by Ephraim London, applied the liberal Roth test to film, meaning now as long as a film had socially redeeming value and its overall effect was not to appeal to prurient interest, it was legal and could not be suppressed. Local censor hands were now somewhat tied by the Supreme Court. Hollywood, on the other hand, was still ultimately beholden to the Legion of Decency and the Production Code, so it went into all-out assault on them, both. In 1964, alone, the Legion faced by far more code-breaking films than any previous year. 34 films, of which 20 were major Hollywood productions. Monsieur Thomas Little of the Legion reported at that time, quote, would have been released with scenes employing nudity, end quote, had his organization not successfully pressured them to edit it. There was one film that year that wasn't to be dismissed so easily, though, The Pawnbroker, which was centered around the Holocaust. The Jews cleverly weaved the nudity into scenes that they could claim were necessary to the movie. This being a Holocaust film, the moral responsibility was entirely flipped on its head. The Jews were not in the wrong for wanting to put nudity on the big screen. The censors were in the wrong for condemning it. It was art, they argued, not smut, and the Holocaust was a deeply emotional topic for the poor Jews who had just suffered so much at the hands of the Nazis. Though thoroughly intimidated by the Jews' Holocaust, guilt-tripping the Production Code Administration and the Legion nevertheless both rejected the pawnbroker, recognizing that allowing it would be the first step on a slippery slope. Quote, "If we were to agree to that, how could we hold back the next one?" End quote. The Jews released the film anyway, uncut and without code approval, through Allied Artists, which was controlled at the time by the Jewish Mirisch family. The Jewish producer of The Pawnbroker, Eli Landau, then appealed the film to the board of the MPAA. The board overturned the prior ruling and awarded the movie a seal, claiming the, quote, "sole exception granted The Pawnbroker is to be viewed as a special and unique case and in no way setting a precedent," end quote. This, of course, was nonsense, and everybody knew it. The pawnbroker exception set off a string of events that saw the production code completely abandoned within 5 years. It was replaced by the MPAA rating system, which is still used today, though it has been altered a bit throughout the years. Initially, the rating system was G for general, M for mature, R for restricted, and X for not rated. Michael Redved, in his book Hollywood vs. America, gives us many astonishing statistics about these crucial years, such as the following. Theater profits were a steady 40 to 49 million a week for 12 years prior to the beginning of the dissolution of the code from 1953 through 1965. The numbers then dropped from 44 million to 1965 to 17.5 million in 1969. That is almost a full 2/3 loss of theater goers and profit. From 1966 to 1967 alone, it went from 38 million to 17.8 million, well over 50% drop in 1 year. Medved goes on to show how G-rated movies make an overwhelmingly larger monetary returns than others, more than twice as much as R-rated movies on average, with PG-13 and PG-rated movies falling pretty evenly in between. Yet the producers have continuously made more and more R-rated films and less G-rated ones, in spite of the millions upon millions, possibly billions of guaranteed profits going out the window. Even foul language, Medved reveals, is shown to be rejected by huge majorities of potential moviegoers in innumerable surveys, yet it has only, as we all well known, gotten more and more offensive over time. Medved is a Jew himself, and as such is a staunch apologist for his tribe's role in Hollywood. He feigns ignorance as to why his own data shows what it does, choosing to place the blame on liberalism. But those of us with the PC blinders off, who are willing to deploy even a modicum of common sense, know there can only be one true explanation for this phenomenon. The Jews are more concerned with demoralizing society and pushing their own ethnic and political agenda than they are in making profits. And we all know how much the Jews love profits. Those figures and Medved's book in general are in and of themselves proof that the Jews are using film as a weapon to deliberately attack the morality of Gentile society, just as they admittedly do with outright hardcore pornography, as we'll see in Part 9. This is not conjecture by an anti-Semite, but an incontrovertible fact, throughout documented by a Jew, and it needs to be understood. To draw further contrast between these years, it's worth noting that in 1965, the Academy Award for Best Picture went to the G-rated, family-friendly musical, The Sound of Music, and in 1969, the very first year after the breakdown of the code, it went to the United Artists' disturbing X-rated film Midnight Cowboy. Midnight Cowboy was directed by the Jew John Schlesinger and features multiple scenes of homosexuality and other perversions, including one where the cowboy character, meant to symbolize the quintessential masculine heterosexual white American male, is forcibly sodomized. The year 1969 also saw the founding of the first explicit hardcore porn advocacy group, the Adult Film Association of America. David Friedman, the aforementioned Jew of sexploitation fame, was elected as its president 5 times. The popularity of sexploitation films had waned quite significantly by this time due to the fact that hardcore porn featuring actual sex was now becoming more acceptable. In January of 1968, the Swedish countercultural sex film I Am Curious, Yellow, had been seized by customs after being imported by the Jew Barney Rosset, who, as we discuss in depth in Part 4, had also been at the forefront of the major landmark obscenity cases in regard to banned books in the mid-60s, namely Lady Chatterley's Lover and Tropic of Cancer. I Am Curious, Yellow, featured multiple scenes of nudity and simulated sex, including one where the lead actress is shown kissing a flaccid penis. Rosette paid Sandrews, the Swedish film company that produced I Am Curious Yellow, $100,000 in order to secure American distribution rights for the film and agreed to pay them 30% of its profits. He also promised to pay all legal fees should the film run into trouble, boasting that he, quote, may win for the film industry the same freedom afforded literature in the Lady Chatterley's Lover case, end quote. Being the first movie that featured sex and nudity to be shown in regular theaters rather than back alley porn theaters, viewers flocked to see I Am Curious, Yellow. By September 1969, it had already grossed $5 million. A month later, it became, quote, the first foreign language film to top Variety's lists of the top grossing films, end quote. Predictably, the film became the subject of many obscenity trials across the country. It was shown in 53 cities and contested in 15, ultimately getting banned in about 10 states. The Second U.S. Court of Appeals eventually overturned the New York customs ban, but this was not a nationwide ruling, as those, of course, only come from the Supreme Court. When the Supreme Court did finally hear the case, it ended with a 4-4 split. Justice William O. Douglas, who was a radical First Amendment absolutist, had recused himself due to a conflict of interest. Some of his anti-censorship writings had been featured in Rosette's journal, Evergreen Review. The split upheld the lower court's ruling by default, and though this still did not overturn decisions in other parts of the country, it nevertheless spelled the end of the censorship of I Am Curious, Yellow. As it became clear the issue would never be decisively resolved in the censor's favor. Although the film earned Rosette an astonishing $14 million, but ironically, by paving the way for true pornography, it undercut the business model of his publishing company, Grove Press. Quote, I Am Curious Yellow was a big success, end quote, he said in an interview, quote, but it was a disaster for us in many ways, because we made a lot of money. I went and bought a lot of foreign films, which were no longer commercially viable because all the art theaters had closed down, overnight in 1970. They had started showing X-rated porno films. There had been a big market for foreign films in this country, and suddenly it was gone. After I Am Curious Yellow played, that was the end. We killed our own market, end quote. In the first post-Curious above ground pornographic films, Andy Warhol's Blue Movie, 1969, and Mona the Teenage Nymph, 1970, the sex was shown while the man had a flaccid penis, carefully following the I Am Curious Yellow precedent, and then it progressively became more graphic. By 1972, the infamous full-on hardcore porno, Deep Throat, was a nationwide theatrical blockbuster, earning over $100 million and staying on Variety's list of top 10 highest grossing movies for 48 weeks. Deep Throat was soon followed by the similarly successful Behind the Green Door, 1972, and The Devil in Miss Jones, 1973. A nationwide backlash to these and other liberal excesses swept conservative Republican Richard Nixon into power in 1969, and there was a last-ditch effort to stem the tide of hardcore pornography. This effort, which culminated in the Nixon-stacked Supreme Court's 1973 Miller decision, the precedent of which still stands as the test of obscenity today, and the preeminent Jewish role in hardcore pornography from then up to its present time will be the topic of Part 9. All right, so I will see you guys all on the next video for Chapter 9. Thank you.